All right, I guess we're recording.
What's up, guys?
Welcome,
Coach Thomas here.
Coach Hurd. This lovely backdrop that you see behind us.
Quarantine.
We are, we're going to do the best with what we got on this. And today we're going to go ahead and start talking about, well, we have talked about the Renaissance. Now we're going to start looking at Renaissance writers and then transition to artists. All right, so what we're going to be talking about today in terms of writing, we will look at Dante, Petrarch, a little bit of Boccaccio, and Machiavelli. All right, so one of the things that we started talking about out of the Renaissance is that it was the transition from this idea that in the medieval world, there were no expectations for the individual. I mean, Coach Thomas, so like, what were you expected to be able to know how to do in the Middle Ages?
Survive.
Yeah, survive, farm. Nobody cared what you were or what you could do. If you were going to advance in this world, your parents had to be nobility. So it was really just luck of the straw. If you were born to a noble, you got noble privileges. If you were born to a peasant, well, that's what you were for the rest of your life. But some of the things we talked about that led to the end of the Renaissance, like the Crusades and the bringing back of trade to Europe, and people realizing that they no longer had to live on the manor and they could enter cities and start kind of equalizing with the rest of the world in terms of earning their own way. With the Crusades, a lot of people left manors and realized that Europe wasn't as dangerous as they had been told. And they realized that through trade and cultural diffusion, that they could break that feudal system. So that's really what we're talking about, is the focus of the individual and some of these writers, because that's how people started to learn. In the Middle Ages, and I know Coach Thomas talked about this, the literacy rate was gone. Like Coach said, it was all about survival. And when you're trying to survive, you're not really worried about being able to read a book. So what we're going to start talking about today is this idea of focusing on individuals and putting literature in people's hands that they could read because it was in their vernacular. So that's the first key word. So many writers followed Dante, who we will look at, who wrote something called a series called the Divine Comedy, and it was written in the vernacular or the local language of the people in Italy.
I like to look at vernacular as I kind of talk about it in the case of the Bible. The Bible was written in Latin, but if you couldn't read or understand Latin, then you basically had to take the priest's word for what it was in. So as soon as the Bible began to be written in vernacular, or the written language of the people, aka in our case, English, now it changes everything, because I can now read the Bible and say, and figure out what it means for myself and not take the priest's word for it. That's how important vernacular is.
Absolutely. So what we're going to see is people start writing in their native language, or how they talk, whatever it may be, in their own slang, how they speak day to day, entered into their writing, rather than in, just like Coach Thomas said, the original Greek or Latin. Especially when it comes to the Bible, it was translated from Hebrew, Aramaic, first into Greek, and then into Latin, where it really stayed until we get to the Protestant Reformation and the Anglican Church, which we'll be talking about next week. So, I mean, you have to remember, after the fall of Rome, when all these Germanic tribes came into Europe, they started creating these different Germanic kingdoms. And out of these kingdoms, we find different languages that meshed with German. We see modern Italian. After the Norman invasion, English and French that came out of the Frankish Empire with Charlemagne. And so what we're going to see is that Renaissance writers are going to start talking about or writing about self-expression, all right, and this idea of portraying the individual, okay, which is something that had really been unheard of, because in the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, no one really cared what the individual brought to the table. It was all about owning land or being the son or daughter of a noble. All right, Dante, the Divine Comedy. So Dante was an Italian poet, a writer, a theorist, a philosopher, and a political thinker. The guy could do a lot of things. He was very smart, very intelligent. We're going to come up with this concept of something called the Renaissance man, someone who was well-talented, well-rounded, not just good at one thing, but good at multiple things. Born in Florence, Italy. If you'll recall, before we left, which some of you may not, the most important city during the Renaissance was Florence. He is referred to as the father of the Italian language. He did not invent Italian. He did not start Italian. However, his use of writing in the Italian vernacular kind of set the standard for proper Italian. Kind of like how here we talk about speaking in proper English and not using slang, things of that nature. Wrote the Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy is a poem where Dante, it's a made-up story, so it's nonfiction, correct?
Correct.
And Dante travels through hell, purgatory, and heaven. And we really haven't dived into that idea of purgatory, kind of mentioned it a couple of times, but purgatory is something in the Catholic faith. Because Thomas, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's kind of one of those deals where you weren't good enough to get to heaven. You really didn't deserve hell. So you kind of go to this place and you wait it out. And after your sentence is up, you get to go to heaven.
And purgatory is just, and the root word is purge. So you can't go to heaven with sin. And so you got to go to purgatory first and then purge, get rid of all your sin, and then go to heaven. Some people stay there longer than others based on what type of sin and what you did while you were on earth. So yes, that's.
And it's broken up into three different parts. You have Dante's Inferno, which is one of the most well-known writings. You have Purgatorio, which is a reference to purgatory, and Paradiso, which is obviously paradise or heaven. Petrarch. Petrarch, sometimes called the father of humanism. Humanism is this idea that you go back and you find resources, writings, to study the Greek and Romans, or as they're referred to as the classics. He was a great poet. He wrote in both Italian and Latin. He wrote sonnets, and it was kind of weird. I say weird because he never met this woman. He was in love with this woman from a distance. Her name was Laura, and he just kind of followed her around, had these ideas of marrying her and expressing his love. Never happened because she got the bubonic plague and she died.
Back to humanism, just went because if we were taking a test, humanism would be a big part of it. Humanism is basically, as Coach Hurd said a few slides ago, it's going back towards the individual, to focus on the individual. You see people writing in humanism that's talking about everyday life, as opposed to the writings before, which was usually talking about the church or the afterlife. Now we're talking about everyday life, how this affects me. Someone that's painting in humanism is usually going to paint someone that's naked, to focus on the human body, to focus on the individual.
It's about rebuilding society in the idea of the ancient Greeks and the Romans. Those are really the only writings that were left behind. We talked about how priests sat in rooms and they copied the Bible. They didn't just copy Bibles. They copied any literature they could get their hands on. And a lot of people during that time period were just infatuated or really interested in the ideas or the philosophy of the Greeks and of the Romans. And since Rome had been the most powerful empire that the world had ever seen, after the Middle Ages, it's kind of like, all right, we need to rebuild society. And who better to model than the most successful empire? And it was familiar to them. So they look back. We're going to see in Italy that they start rebuild. Well, we kind of talked about that, but like Florence was a city-state. It was its own country within Italy. Uh, and there will be others that pop up. But the idea of humanism was that, hey, we need to look back to the Greeks for their philosophy and the Romans, and not just philosophy, but their arts, their architecture, their laws, everything. And we need to mimic that in a way that can basically progress Europe. All right, Boccaccio. Now, Boccaccio, and here's the common theme between all the Renaissance writers. They all wrote in vernacular. They all wrote in a native tongue and that was something that really wasn't present because, as Coach Thomas talked about, the church, they kind of put a monopoly on literature. If you're going to read the Bible, which no one could during the Middle Ages, the only people that could read it if they had a Bible were the priests. And it was all in Latin, and they had power by doing so. So Boccaccio writes a book called or a literature called the Decameron. And remember, it's the Renaissance. One of the factors that led to the end of the Middle Ages was not just the Crusades, but also the bubonic plague. So he's going to write about stuff that would have been familiar to him, things that he would have witnessed or stories that he would have heard about. It's really a not too distant future from the bubonic plague. So in the Decameron, he writes about these 7 women and 3 men who hide out kind of like, it's called a villa, but it's basically like an apartment. And what they do is to pass time, and they're hiding out to escape the bubonic plague. There's this idea that if you're out in the community and you're breathing the same air as everyone else, you're going to get it. And
ironically enough,
yeah,
here we are.
It's true. But they're trying to waste time. They're tired of staring at the 4 walls all day and looking at each other. So at night, they just kind of tell different stories. And a lot of the stories are a series of realistic, sometimes off-colored stories, which kind of like abstract, probably, embellishing, trying to make the story a little bit more interesting. And the Decameron presents both tragic and comic views of life because the stories are talking about real life. They're talking about the tragedies that everyone faces in their life's experience. And one of the reasons it's a tragedy is that here these people are, they're gathered, these 10 people are gathered in this villa. They're swapping these stories. They're trying to pass the time. They're trying to escape the plague. Unbeknownst to them, it's the rats that are in their home that carry the fleas that then gets onto them, and they all get the plague and they die. Machiavelli, very important, very important. If we were to take a test over this, utmost importance.
But I think he also applies to, life more than anybody we're going to talk about.
Oh, absolutely. So Machiavelli wrote a book called The Prince. And I don't know if y'all remember, but we talked about a banking family that rose in Florence called the Medici. And I called them the first mafia. If people got in their way or obstructed their power, those people disappeared. Those people were moved out of those positions, and the Medici just continued to rise and take further control of politics, and basically became the ruling family of Florence and helped really usher in the Renaissance and further Europe. But in this book, it explains how a ruler can gain power and keep it in spite of all the people that want to take it from him. And he said that most people, talking about the general population, were selfish and corrupt, that they didn't know what was good for them. And there's no point in trying to please them because you can't do it. It's been my life experience that trying to make everyone happy, I can't do it. Making everyone really mad at me, that's pretty easy. Now, in the Prince, this idea that a ruler should not be concerned with what's morally right. When you start talking about morals, I think the easiest way to look at that would be like from a Christian perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Don't kill. Is it morally right to lie to your people? No, probably not. If there's someone standing on the street corner talking about how bad of a ruler you are with his picket sign, and then the next day you go out there and you realize that that person has disappeared and you never see him again, is that morally right? No. Is that guy out there picketing anymore? No. So it's really about doing the politically effective thing. It's this idea that it's not a good idea for a leader or a ruler to lie to the people. But if you got to lie to them for a political advantage, well, that's just what you got to do. Because you know what's the best interest for your people, because they're selfish and corrupt.
All's fair in love and war. Whatever it takes to keep power.
It's better to be feared than loved. And this may involve misleading your people, which is something that I just referenced. But what he's saying is, if you're trying to be the nice guy and do what's right for everybody, you're going to fail. What you got to do is what's in the best interest for yourself and the country, and the people just need to come along. And it basically became the textbooks for all would-be and rulers. Other Northern Renaissance writers, William Shakespeare, which y'all have read much about in your literature classes. And just to kind of sum up writing, is that they wrote in a vernacular. So they wrote in how they talk. How you talk every day, even with your friends, is your vernacular. It's how you speak. So they wrote in the style of the people that they were trying to get the information to. They wanted people to learn. They wanted people to be able to read it. And they started focusing more on people in everyday life rather than just about God, which Coach Thomas said that the main literature during the Middle Ages, which no one could read except for the Catholic Church officials, was the Bible. So it's really moving away from just religion and focusing on people in everyday life. And it's the theme that is still used today by modern writers. The Renaissance is really considered the beginning of modern history. And it's basically from this period on to where we are now is I would say the cornerstone or the building blocks of modern society.
Yes,
is the Renaissance.
Mm-hmm. It's where people began to once again finally question things. They look at the Roman Empire, they look at Socrates, then you have the Middle Ages, and now we're getting back to that. Let's finally start questioning whether it be the church or our political rulers.
All right, so now we're going to transition to art during this period. So Michelangelo or Michelangelo, however you prefer, Donatello, Leonardo da Vinci, and Raphael.
Ninja Turtles.
The Ninja Turtles. They're all named after Renaissance artists. If you know the Ninja Turtles names, well, then you're a step ahead of the game. So art during the Renaissance. Now, like in the Middle Ages, art was not very realistic. It was very flat. There was no dimensions or depths to it. It was just kind of cartoonish. And when we talked about the bubonic plague, all the art surrounded death. But with this idea of going back to the Greeks and the Romans and glorifying their cultures, we are going to see some realistic art. This is where that begins. And art during the Renaissance was supported by patrons. Basically, a patron is just someone that says, "Hey, Coach Thomas, you're a great painter. I want you to come paint for me, and I'm going to pay you to do that." So it was basically, as an artist, these were the people you sought out to pay your wages. You earned a living painting for these people. Medieval artists, they used religious subjects and they conveyed spiritual ideas. Everything in the Middle Ages was all about religion.
Mm-hmm. I like to think of it like this. In the Middle Ages, you would paint to glorify God. In the Renaissance, you're going to paint, and you may paint a portrait of Jesus or Mary, but you're going to paint it to glorify the person who owns the paint or the person who did the painting. The individual.
That's right. And Renaissance artists will portray religious subjects, but use realistic styles in the form of Greek and Roman models. Renaissance painters used perspective, which showed 3 dimensions. I can't put it clearly other than this: a very realistic image, looking real.
Mm-hmm. Perspective is, I'm going to draw it in 3D. I put it like this: not before perspective. You may have a painter. I kind of put it like this: the images of a family on the back of a van. That's 2D. That's not perspective. You have the dad next to the mom, next to the kid, next to the dog. That's how they painted in the Middle Ages. With the Renaissance, perspective means I'm going to maybe put the family together, but I'm going to have the kid throwing a ball in the background and make it look like he's far away, even though it's on a blank sheet of paper. That's perspective.
It's kind of like when you take those early art lessons and you draw that line across the paper and you create your vanishing line.
Yes.
You draw the road into that line and the road gets smaller. Maybe draw a really small city background to show depth in the image. And they often used frescoes. Kind of a random thing to put in there about oftentimes using frescoes, but a fresco is a wet plaster. What you need to know about early artwork is that the paints were not like what we have today. They didn't have a primer that kept paint lasting. Like when you paint a house, you put primer and then you put the paint over it. That way you don't have to repaint your house every year. But before that, they would take like fruits, different berries, maybe some flowers, and they would in egg yolk, and they would crush that all together and create a mixture. And that's how they use their paints. And what we'll see a little later on is The Last Supper by Da Vinci. It did not use a fresco. It was that very old style of paint that I just talked about, the ingredients. So just like different flowers and fruits and things of that nature, that the different dyes that you can put into the egg yolk. Well, the biggest issue with Da Vinci's Last Supper is that paint dries out and begins crackling and will actually fall off the wall. So with The Last Supper, it's kind of like a 24-hour deal to just constantly keep it preserved, keep the right temperatures in the room, have people come in. They're called curators, and they work on the art. But with this fresco, it's basically a fresco's wet plaster, kind of like if you punch a hole in your wall and you want to you got to go and kind of get this screen that goes over the hole, and then you put wet plaster, you sand it down. But the plaster allowed the paints to soak in and really last a really long time. So once again, a reference back to the Ninja Turtles: Michelangelo, Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael. So Michelangelo, or Michelangelo, however you prefer, that'd be up to you. He was a sculptor, a painter, an architect, and poet. And right before that, it says Renaissance man. A Renaissance man is just somebody who can do a lot of things. My reference to a Renaissance man in today's world would be like a LeBron James. I mean, yeah, LeBron James is a great basketball player. But I really believe that if he'd have grown up with a baseball bat, the guy would be in Major League Baseball. Or if he'd have got a golf club, he'd be on the PGA Tour.
Michael Jordan was the same way. He played minor league baseball, great golfer, you know, Renaissance, do a lot of stuff.
Yeah, just someone that's real talented. Once again, we're talking about the individual. We're not just talking about, hey, look, you just need to know how to farm. What all can you do? And then we're going to glorify you for what you can. And like what we do with professional athletes today. Now, even though he was a painter and a poet, the dude liked sculpting. Made some of the greatest sculptures the world has ever seen. Famous for the way he portrayed the human body, and he did it in the Greek form. He wanted to glorify the subject as nude.
Mm-hmm.
And he wouldn't have sculpted somebody like me or Coach Thomas. He would have sculpted somebody that was just like ripped, had all kinds of muscles. And it was all about glorifying the individual. He did the statue, the David. The most famous work, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
The dome of St. Petersburg Cathedral, or Basilica.
Yeah.
Basilica. So the David. All right. And if you really take a moment to really just, this is one massive piece of marble that he used. And he took a hammer and a chisel and he created this from just one massive stone of marble.
Just my thing is the detail. I mean, in all of these Renaissance artists, is the amount of detail that they put in their work, from the hair to the eyes. I mean, and you can take this, and it's just about the same as the Roman sculptures back during the Roman times. So that's what we're getting back to, the Renaissance in general, back to Greece and Rome.
Go ahead.
The Sistine Chapel is, you've probably seen it before. This is this is the center of the Sistine Chapel, where God created Adam, but the ceiling is the creation story, from the heavens and the earth, the seas, to the animals, and then you have in the center God touching Adam, breathing life into man, and then on the sides it has the fall of man, where Adam and Eve eats the apple, and then on the back wall you have the judgment, the last judgment, where Gabriel is calling all humans into heaven or into the lake of fire. It's pretty awesome.
And I don't know if y'all can see my cursor on here, but this was actually a very controversial piece right here, because in the church was really mad about it when he painted it, because he portrayed God here with a belly button. And Michelangelo's whole deal and argument was God created man in the image of him. But the problem with the belly button is that you say that God was born. Because you got to be born to have a belly button. People today have taken this image of God and said, wow, I mean, it looks like Michelangelo painted it in the form of a human brain, a divine consciousness, if you will. These are just some more images. Go ahead, Coach.
The Sistine Chapel is in Rome, in the Vatican City, and it's still used today. As a matter of, I mean, millions of people go every year to see it, but it's pretty cool. Still used today. They use it to pick a pope. What they would do is they would take all the cardinals and they lock them in. This is the chapel. This is a reverent place. And if you go there today, you see people praying on the altar right in the front. But they literally take a chain and they lock these all the cardinals in one room, and they keep them in there until they have unanimously chosen a pope. So this Sistine Chapel was used for that same reason for hundreds of years.
And once again, here's another image of the ceiling. Once again, talking about how Coach Thomas referenced how it's the stories of the Old Testament, especially in the centerpiece, from, let there be light, to our coming out of the void, let there be light, the creation of the waters, the touch, original sin, getting kicked out of Eden, to Noah's Ark, and finding land. It's a lot of biblical stories on the ceiling. And here's that backdrop that Coach Thomas was talking about, oftentimes referenced to as the rapture, where the dead are lifted from their graves, and people who are living today or alive during that period, shouldn't have said today, but whenever that time period happens according to Christianity, people will be raised to heaven or in this great judgment, and some will be sent to the lake of fire. And here is the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Basically a tomb for the popes.
Yeah, they built.
This was for Pope Julius II, right? It has the Moses in it, yeah.
And the actual site is where they believe that St. Peter was, after he was crucified upside down, was buried. So yeah, this is where it's for the popes.
But he designed and basically led the building of the dome. Donatello. Made sculpture more realistic by carving natural postures. Basically, he's a little different in that, and the easiest way I would identify him is Michelangelo wanted to do the Greek form of people. So real muscular, kind of a man's man, and even his female subjects are very muscular. Donatello was more natural, how people just really look in the real world. So if you look at his David in this example, David isn't muscled up. It's really more natural. It's almost got a feminine quality to it.
But you still see that he's naked. I mean, you would never see this in the Middle Ages. Never would you see a sculpture, a painting of someone naked in the Middle Ages. But in the Renaissance, again, we're trying to get back to the individual. And so let's represent the individual in its purity.
And this is the equestrian statue of Gadamalta. Now, equestrian is a reference to horseback riding. Da Vinci. Painter, sculptor, inventor, and scientist, Renaissance man.
The Renaissance man.
The Renaissance man. Interested in how things worked. He kind of did some things that if they would have ever found out that he was doing it, he would have been arrested and probably put to death for it. For example, he used to go buy cadavers, and a cadaver is a dead body. And he would go to the morgue and he would purchase these dead bodies, and he would cut them open to see what the insides of people looked like and how it worked. His famous works, the Mona Lisa, the Last Supper, Virgin on the Rocks. And a guy named Dan Brown actually wrote a very popular and controversial work called the Da Vinci Code, which he basically said that Da Vinci was part of maybe the Knights Templar, which was a branch of the Catholic Church during the Crusades. They end up getting expelled from the church. It's just a really long story to go into that. But he said that there was hidden messages within Da Vinci's art. The Mona Lisa. You've all seen it. I can go back.
Okay. Cool thing, the Mona Lisa is probably, the size of a newspaper. It's really little bitty. And I know Coach Hurd is going to talk about this in a minute, but a couple of controversial things about the Mona Lisa is, or what I was going to say was, at this picture here, you can see the perspective. You can see how there's roads behind her, there's mountains behind her, and even though it's a portrait, it's focused on this lady, I guess you'd say. You can still see the perspective of everything pushed back.
There's some hypothesis that Da Vinci actually was kind of sitting around one day and was like, I wonder what I'd look like if I was a woman. So it's basically his own interpretation of what he would look like as a female. We don't know that for fact, but it's just one of those things that have been circulating for quite a long time.
And I think that's why it makes the Mona Lisa. That's what makes the Mona Lisa so. Because if you go to look at this painting, it's not really anything spectacular compared to some other stuff, but it's the allure of who was she? You know, where did she come from? You know, what was Da Vinci thinking? Is what makes the Mona Lisa so important.
The Last Supper. We're not going to go into all the details, but it's a famous work of art. Here we have Christ, and he is basically telling everybody, "Hey, look, I'm about to be betrayed, and it's somebody in here."
You can see again perspective with the windows and the scenery in the background.
This is the Last Supper, where it is currently. Okay, and it's a constant work to keep it restored and try to keep this work of art around for as long as possible. It was almost destroyed during the wars. A bomb was dropped right on top of the building and almost destroyed the actual mural itself. But here's some examples of some of his sketches. Once again, I told you that he would buy dead bodies and he would peel the skin back. He wanted to see what muscles really look like underneath flesh so that he could better draw his subjects.
It was blasphemous because the church said that if you are not to harm a dead body, supposed to put them in the ground before a certain time period, because again, your body's going to go into heaven in the rapture. So by him desecrating the body, it was a big sin. But how do we know? How do we get to know how the body works without opening it up?
I mean, he was just drawing sketches, but everyone who got the literature after him, they use it as textbooks, as like, wow, this is really helpful to people that would be doctors, kind of like the very first medical books. But on the top left, you can see a helicopter, and on the bottom left, he has this kind of flying contraption going on. And they've actually remade these models, and they work. Raphael learned from studying Leonardo and Michelangelo. One of his favorite subjects was the Madonna. Madonna is just a reference to the Virgin Mary and Jesus. Famous works: School of Athens, Marriage of the Virgin.
I like this one here because this painting is the Renaissance. If you don't learn anything else or don't remember anything else about what we talked about, it's this painting. It's the School of Athens. And what he did was, just like what the Renaissance is. The Renaissance is a rebirth of Greece and Rome. So what he did in this painting is he took Renaissance artists, even himself. If you can look closely, maybe you can find Raphael in this picture. He painted himself in there. But he painted people like Da Vinci and Michelangelo, and he put them in a room with Athens philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle. This is the Renaissance, how we need to get back. Let's do away with the Middle Ages. Let's get away from this whole Dark Ages and non-learning. Let's get back to Greece and Rome. And so he paints the Renaissance artists with Greek philosophers. Let's see what we can learn from these people. If we can all get together in one room, how cool that would be.
That's the best way to look at it. Once again, it's just showing perspective, central figures.
I think that's Michelangelo, and he painted the guy on the left here, the old man. He painted Socrates and Da Vinci as one person, which is pretty cool. Which is that last one?
The last one?
The last one, the guy, Raphael painted himself over there kind of in the corner.
And this is just the Marriage of the Virgin, but once again, you're looking at the perspective, the depth, the three dimensions. the realism of the actual art. All right, so that will conclude our very first lesson during this break. Well, shouldn't even call it this break because it's the direction of the school year, but this is the first one. So what we're going to do is we're going to have some assignments that you will find underneath this link. And if you have any questions, we will be posting a period of time that you can possibly even have a Google Meet with us where we can see face to face and interact, whatever questions you may have. Anything? Good?
Good to go.